Hi, welcome back to YourTown. I'm King Grossman, your host, and we're about to start our third segment with a really wonderful guest and a friend of mine, a new friend of mine here in Carmel. We both hail from Texas, but Dr. Gerry Maddoux. Gerry is a cardiovascular surgeon, a cardiologist, and an author, and it's I'm really looking forward to our conversation because Gerry is probably more on the conservative political spectrum. I'm more on the liberal political spectrum. But we both found some common ground here in universal health care and as a delivery system for our health care. And I'm really looking forward to talking about that. One of my passions right now, especially in these times where the political landscape is so polarized, is to find common ground with those that don't have all of your same political views and get some positive things done. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Welcome.
Thank you.
Gerry. But before we get into healthcare, let's talk about your writing. I know you're an author, and you mentioned a piece to me just here as we were sitting before in the green room before getting started. And so, what are you working on right now, or tell me some good things about your writing.
I'm editing a piece right now called Organ Grinder. It's I write about the dark side of medicine mostly.
Okay.
So it's a fellow whose wife has refractory depression, can't be treated. She's suicidal. The system has kind of let her down, so he winds up finding a way to treat her that's sort of on the black market and does it himself.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So it's kind of, I write about this underbelly of medicine.
That's lovely.
So
yeah, well,
that's the
intriguing.
story.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Well, and I'm an author, and you write about what you know, and so
Sure.
You bring color to that. So is this in the form of a novel or a short story? Or
No, a novel.
A novel. Wonderful, wonderful. So what is your writing process when you're writing a novel? Do you write every day? Do you have a certain time? How do you approach the blank page?
I get up early. I made rounds at 5 o'clock for 30 years, 35 years, so I get up early and write whatever comes into my head. Mm-hmm. So I never know where I have no idea of the plot. I have no idea what I'm going to write. I just write.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And then when I finish it, I read it through and make a few changes and clean it up a little. Right. And that's so I write. It makes you vulnerable, but I write whatever comes into my head.
So you let your characters kind of, did you
Sure.
find they tell you where you need to go?
I let their names come to me. I let their actions come to me. I don't try to, I have no plot in my head when I start. Mm-hmm. And I have no idea what the first thing is going to be typed in.
That's fabulous.
I do it on a word processor, but I just write it out.
Yeah. Well, I always enjoy talking to other authors about their process because
Sure.
I find that there is a spectrum. There are those that don't know what the words are going to be or the direction of the story is going to be every morning when they sit down and begin to write, and that's obviously the category you fall in. But some of the great authors work that way, and there are others on the whole other end of the spectrum. John Irving maps out, he'll spend 18 months mapping out a story before he gets started.
Right.
So just as in any other art form, you have to find, I guess, the way that works for you.
He's more successful than I am.
Well, yeah, he's good. But getting discovered as a writer, there's a lot of great writing out there, and
Sure.
so So I appreciate that. So, well, moving over to our universal health care coverage as a possible solution for our healthcare delivery system. If you wouldn't mind just talking to us about and the viewers and me about how you evolved because you were inside the system and really spent an entire career there. How have you kind of come to a place where you'd say this may be something we need to really look at?
I look at this differently than everyone else in the world. And the thing about I think one of the things that makes healthcare so difficult, trying to get a system of healthcare so difficult, is that everyone looks at it differently. Mm-hmm. And you look at it probably from your place in life. And but I've been fascinated with healthcare since I was a kid, because my older brother died of bulbar polio. And that was not that long after the war, and my father followed everything that was going on, and my dad paid for all of his care, but it came close to bankrupting my father. And it took him a few years to pay it off. And so I kind of followed what had happened. I think healthcare reached a pivotal point in the aftermath of World War II. There were, to back up a little bit, in Great Britain, at the First War, all of these people, when they sounded the alarm that war was going to occur, all of these men showed up in Great Britain to volunteer. And much to their dismay, they discovered that 40% of them were malnourished, or lame, or heavily diseased, or had rotten teeth. Most of these poor fellows couldn't really effectively serve as soldiers. There was a guy about that time named Beveridge. You've probably never heard of him. In healthcare, he's not known. He was an economist. He later went on and became head of the London School of Economics.
Okay.
But he kind of goes along all these years, and in the aftermath of World War II, there were all of these lost people, disenfranchised. They were missing a limb, or they were shell-shocked, or they had disease, they had TB, or they had trench foot, they had this and that, and there was no good way to treat them. And so Beveridge said he wanted to eliminate the 5 great evils, and those evils were want, abject poverty, idleness, disease, and something else. But he put it in a way people could really understand it, and in 1947, he instituted what became known as the National Health Service in Great Britain.
Okay.
Interestingly, and something nobody ever speaks to, is that in 1947 there were 2 senators in the United States who were facing the same dilemma in the United States. We had all of these lost people, same problems, shell-shocked, aimless, and there were thousands of them.
Yes.
And so these 2 senators, one from Alabama, one from Ohio, it was Hill and Burton, and I can't remember which came from where, but it's not important. They developed a thing called the Hill-Burton Act, same year, 1947. So the Hill-Burton Act said, okay, we're going to give federal funding to beef up hospitals so they can take care of the veterans. You know, these shot up people who had nowhere to go. But in order to receive federal funding, you're going to have to put a plaque up in your hospital that says the Hill-Burton Act. And if you show up here, we'll treat you.
Okay.
Even if you don't have money.
Right.
So as the years go along, I've practiced under the
Hill-Burton Act.
the Hill-Burton Act, and I thought it was fine.
Yes.
And it was fine, but we've outstripped the Hill-Burton Act by a long way.
Yes.
And the way am I going on about this? You want to hear it?
This is exactly
Okay.
what I want to hear.
So now, if you go to any emergency room, you'll still see a plaque on the wall that says, if you are brought here, or if you arrive here, or if you're shot outside, no matter how you get here, it is our duty to look at you and to treat you, to give you help. So as a doctor, as a practicing cardiologist, to get on the hospital staff, which you have to be on, you have to join the ER roster. So when it comes your time to
You take your turn.
you take your turn. If there are 10 cardiologists in that hospital, every 10th night and every 10th weekend, you're on the ER call. And if a patient comes in and they have no money and no means of payment for their care, they have to have care provided by the hospital, and you have to provide them care as a representative of the hospital on their ER call. So that's kind of charitable work. And when I first started practicing, that was probably 20% of my work. And because of what happened to my brother, my father made me promise at my medical school graduation that I would never turn away anyone for want of ability to pay.
Yes.
So I'm going along with this, and then in the 80s, that jumped up to probably 25%. In the 90s, maybe to 30%, which means that you're roughly a third of your work, especially if you're in an area where there are a lot of agricultural workers,
Right.
for example. Then about a third of my work was indigent
Right. Care.
care. If the government, and this is going to sound greedy, and it's not, if the government at some point had stepped in and said, okay, I see you're providing a lot of indigent care, so for those doctors who continue to take care of those people, we're going to let you deduct that from your taxes as a charitable donation. It would probably have worked. But what happened was that you might have an indigent patient and they're much sicker than the average run of patients because they try not to go to the doctor. Right. They have no money. Their hospital stay may be 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months even. Doctors frequently, if they got disgruntled, they would fire the patient from their practice after that time. So here's a very sick patient, just got out of the hospital, barely escaped death, no doctor. So what do? They go back into the hospital.
Yes.
And they repeat the process.
Yes. So the care, therefore, is not as good because they're sicker when they come, if that's right, if I'm hearing you right. And the other is the cost, from the standpoint of financial cost, is very high because in order to treat them, it takes this very intense care and a long-term stay.
Exactly. So I'm not getting this point across very well, but these people, we've gotten to the point now where we have 60 million Americans who receive food stamps or health care based on need, real need. And I'm trying to put this in the base in medical economic terms, socioeconomic, medical economic terms. These people have gotten, they were in a horrible situation before so-called Obamacare came along. Obamacare at least kind of did away with this process of, okay, I'm going to take care of you while you're in the hospital, but I'm going to fire you from my practice when I get out. I never fired anyone from my practice ever, so I took care of them forever.
They had a doctor.
They had a doctor, and there were a lot of people like me.
Yes.
But there were also a lot of doctors who became disgruntled with the system that they were working under, and they fired those patients the minute they got out of the hospital, the minute they could. It's like a 30-day grace period. And it was creating a very bad ill will between doctors and patients, the hospital, and so forth. So when so-called Obamacare came along, big insurance companies like United Health thought that they could put all of these people into their big pool of 100,000 people or 1 million people or 2 million people, and they could actually titrate them out with folks who did not need as much help. It didn't work. And now that pool of patients, that pool of 60 million patients is so huge that the only way we can absorb that in the overall healthcare industry is to use the total population of the United States as the pool of insurance, if you will.
Right. This is the problem with a public option, because it doesn't get the whole pool of the United States, where whatever, it seems to me, where you spread the cost of the delivery of the health care across the entire population.
Right, exactly.
Because if you don't do that, then those that choose the public option are going to be the most expensive, and the cost will run through the roof. And so the shift to fund it. I've been studying this some. I'm not an expert on it, but I have a pretty well developed opinions on it. And the numbers I'm reading is you save about $500 billion in administrative costs, et cetera, if you shift to the universal health care system, and another 100 from pharmaceutical drug costs that pays for including everyone. And so there's not a situation where you don't pay for including everyone, but the problem is the public the public option where it's not universal sounds good, but you don't get the benefit of spreading that risk over the entire population.
No,
Are we saying a similar thing?
Same thing.
Yes.
It's got to be a huge population to spread the risk over, and not only that, but currently there's no real way to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies.
Yes.
So what are they going to do? They're publicly traded companies. They're going to jack up the price as far as they can until something breaks.
Yes.
And it's broken. So
well, yes, and this is a case where, I come at this from and I'm sure conservatives do as well, from a moral standpoint. You did that on your own, it seems to me. You were trying to provide universal health coverage on your own dime because you didn't fire your patients, but you could have, and a lot did, as you said, and so from that standpoint, it's a moral issue. But then from an economic and financial standpoint, it also makes sense. And so it's kind of one of those situations where we actually have an opportunity to come together from whatever point of view you're looking at this from, it seems to me.
Sure. Things break down.
Yes.
And what happened in America was that our system worked fine. Mm-hmm. And medicine got more commercialized.
Yes.
Pharmaceutical companies got wild. And at this point, we're creating healthcare eats up about 17% of the gross domestic product. In Canada, where they have a national health service, and in Great Britain, that number is about 8 or 9%. If you look at the statistics, there's really despite the fact that the elite care, the high dollar earners or the very wealthy in Canada or Great Britain can hire their own doctors, there's really not that much difference, if any, between mortality and morbidity.
Yes.
And there's absolutely zero difference between mortality and morbidity between Great Britain and us.
And I'll have to say we're running out of time, but we've just scratched the surface on this, and I would love to talk about it some more. But I think this is right what we wanted to do with this show, and that is talk about the intersection of creativity, creative thinking, imagination, and solving real problems in the world. And so I appreciate you being on, Gerry, and hope to have you back on and explore this even more deeply.
Great.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being a part of our show today.